everyone. Welcome in. Let's go. It's another episode of the Wobcast 2.0, episode 3. It's Wobby and the usual cast of characters, Gyles and Chase, here to talk some Vikings football with you. Now, so far in this season of the Wobcast 2.0, we've definitely had a defensive bend to the topics. We're going to shift the focus a little bit more to the offense, specifically talking about the wide receiver room and how we think the Vikings can make some substantial improvements to what is already a strength of their team with a few key moves. We'll get into that later. But first, let's dust off a couple of defensive topics and some other things before we shift that focus to the Vikings offense. Before we do that, though, let's say hi to Gyles and Chase. Hey, guys, how's it going?
Hey, we're doing great. The NFC secured the W in the Pro Bowl, so I think any day that happens, you're sitting in a good spot.
And no Vikings got hurt.
This is true. Knock on wood for the rest of the offseason.
How's Mike McDaniel feeling watching Tyreek Hill get blown up by Jalen Ramsey inadvertently in the Pro Bowl? Oh, my goodness.
I feel like he's blowing up other people's phones based on that call. Like, hey, that's not cool.
If you didn't see that, listeners, please go and watch. I'm sure people listening to this are enthusiastic enough about the sport where they probably watch the Pro Bowl. But if you didn't, you got to go watch it. A definitely hold your breath moment for the Dolphins and Tyreek Hill. Yikes.
I guess the definition of flag football means different things to different people.
Oh, my goodness. I do think it was inadvertent by Jalen Ramsey because there was a lateral involved from Devontae Adams, and but it was a hold your breath moment. Anyway, no worse for the wear. It looks like he's fine. The Vikings, I think, stayed healthy. Some guys showed out, I thought, for the Vikings. I thought Cousins had some moments that looked good, and TJ Hawkinson had a touchdown. So kind of fun to watch that.
Yeah, no, they were cooking. Honestly, I think if they can extend that progression, that excitement, all that talent that's swirling around that and push it into next year, I think we're going to have a great season, but we'll get into that more later.
That's right. All right. The other bowl game we should talk about is the Senior Bowl, which occurred last week. And the important thing about the Senior Bowl, guys, is it's really not about the game that happens on the weekend. It's about the practices.
No one even really shows up to the game, do they?
Once guys
the
are kind
game
of
actually happens.
I mean, some people, they stick around, but people are getting out of town and going to the next thing. And I spent, I don't know how many times I went to the Senior Bowl, but it was 5 or 6 or 7, during my time with the Vikings, maybe more. And it really is about those practices. The coaches and scouts get on the field and they watch the practices. And then, of course, it's about the interviews. For what it's worth, just 3 quick takeaways from the Senior Bowl, and then we'll move on to the Vikings offense and the wide receivers. Yeah. I thought the Gopher center, John Michael Schmitz, had made a really good showing for himself. And I'm hearing that from others as well. Obviously, being from Minnesota, it's easy for us to gravitate toward a Gophers player who's down there. But in reading some reports and talking to some people, he's a guy who really stood out. And this is relevant to the Vikings because regardless of how you feel about Garrett Bradbury, you've got to consider the draft as an option to upgrade at center, right?
Absolutely.
So here's a potential candidate for late first round or early second round, which I believe the Vikings will be in that spot. They already are in the later stages of the first round. But they're a candidate to trade back to the very, very end of the first round or out of the first round and stock up on multiple second round picks. And that's exactly where John Michael Schmitz will probably end up going. Now, most of the time you can get the top center in the draft right around where the Vikings got Bradbury, high teens. I think Schmitz is that type of player, and he's projected to go by some in the second round. So could be some good value there.
Yep.
I think my second observation, guys, overall, it's a good crop of interior offensive linemen at the Senior Bowl. Now, Senior Bowl players generally it's not a bunch of first round picks at the Senior Bowl. They tend to be guys who start really get going in the second, third, and later rounds. If the Vikings are indeed a trade back team, that's where they're going to have a ton of picks. So I like the Vikings' chances to sort of collect some interior offensive linemen in this draft, some of them from the Senior Bowl, some of them not. But I think the Senior Bowl only fortifies the opinion that the draft is the place to look to improve the offensive line. Lastly, lots of good running backs at the Senior Bowl, I thought, and it adds to an already flooded market of running backs because I think the free agent class is very deep at running back. Now the draft class appears to be pretty deep. And so I just think it's be judicious about the cash and cap that you spend on running backs. And that's relevant to the Vikings because they have two very talented running backs in Dalvin Cook and Alexander Mattison, one of whom is already expensive, Dalvin Cook, and another who's going to be expensive, Alexander Mattison. And I would just say be judicious about this because no disrespect to those guys or the position, but you can get good running backs almost anywhere. So some general observations there from the Senior Bowl. We can go to the Vikings wide receiver room and talk Vikings offense if you want, but if you had any reaction to that, Gyles or Chase, go ahead.
Well, two things. John Michael Schmitz, there's a lot of people that were saying that he was the best player at the Senior Bowl, period. Not even necessarily by position. He was that good. If you saw some highlight clips, he was phenomenal. Now, obviously, there's a translation and a transition from college to NFL that doesn't always happen for some players. But if you can make the assumption that he will, I think that's an interesting thing to look at for your first round pick, regardless of where it's at. If it's the current place or if you trade back, I think there's a chance that it's there. Considering how far his stock is driving up, there's a chance that maybe you can't go back. But if your formula this offseason is trying to achieve the number one overall offense in the NFL next year, I would take a hard look at John Michael Schmitz as a way to be able to do that because at the end of the day, Garrett Bradbury isn't under contract. Maybe you bring him back. Maybe you trust him to do that at a certain dollar amount. But if you can upgrade and get cheaper at that position, I'm always interested. So I think that's definitely something to look at. And when it comes to all the other players, I think, I'm really interested to see how they tackle things. When it comes to the running back specifically, I think this offseason may be the hard reset that the market needs because historically, regardless of position, your average salary across position is driven primarily off of the principle of scarcity. How many great players are there? And if there's a few amount of them, it drives prices up, right? And if you feel like you have one, you're willing to pay extra for it. However, if now we have a flood of free agent options that are all perceivably the same level of skill and talent, and you have a bunch of similar level people in the draft, I think that will force all these market salaries to go down because the principle of scarcity simply won't be there. But maybe I'll be proven wrong. But from an economic standpoint, I really think this might help reset for the rest of the league.
I think you're right. And also just when there are a lot of resources available in a certain category, and think about it in your own life, you know, you just don't worry as much about solving that problem. It goes down on your priority list. Therefore, the best resources don't necessarily get allocated to it. And so I think teams will be like, running back is on our things to address this offseason, but we can get him anywhere. So let's address some other things first. And that naturally will drive the market down for those things. And so I totally agree with you, Gyles. I think that's well stated. You know, it's not to say we don't think Dalvin's a good player or Alexander Mattison is worth keeping. I mean, I think Dalvin's a special player. I think Alexander Mattison is a starter in the league, maybe a top, half starter in the league, really, if given a lot of reps.
Absolutely.
But those guys, that's not hard to find. And I think to exacerbate this point, guys, is the Vikings offense with Cousins and O'Connell and Jefferson. We're throwing the ball anyway. We're 11 personnel. We're throwing the ball a bunch. So it's just not a very important position, I don't think, for the Vikings. And so worry about it later. And I'd be very careful about spending cash and cap on that position.
And if I had to pick between an elite running back and an elite offensive line, I'm picking the O-line every time because I think a great O-line can make even a crappy running back look good. Now, if you have an elite O-line with an average or above average running back, I think that's where you're going to have a phenomenal running game versus an elite running back with an average or below average offensive line. I think your results are going to be subpar. And I think maybe that's part of the reason that we weren't super eager to run it this year because our O-line room wasn't necessarily elite. However, I think you have a chance this offseason to maybe change that. I think we were a lot better than they have been in previous years, but this year specifically, there's a chance for this to be quite phenomenal, especially if you can get John Michael Schmitz. But I'll digress. But a lot of opportunity this offseason.
Yep, there is. Last thing before we get into the Vikings offense specifically, guys, still no defensive coordinator. No. Are we worried? I think panic has not set in yet because Brian Flores is there, and the market, Vikings
Yep.
Nation, the market wants Brian Flores. So I don't
Yep.
think they're panicking. However, this thing was like 4 or 5 or 6 candidates, and they're all gone except for 2 of them. And
Yep.
one of them is a holdover from last year's defense. And that will not be something that the nation loves.
No. Yeah.
If it's
I
Mike
would say.
Pettin.
Yeah. I am definitely worried
Okay.
because if I'm looking at the Arizona Cardinal final candidates, I do believe Brian Flores to be one of the top ones. Now, this is pure speculation here, but if I'm looking at the cause for delay in all of this, I see the Cardinals as a team that's doing due diligence on whether they can hire him and get through all the legal elements in relation to what his
Yep.
lawsuit is with the Miami Dolphins. I think they're just trying to make sure they're crossing their T's, dotting their I's before they make that acquisition of Brian. But if I'm the Cardinals, I'm getting Brian Flores. Like, I'm just making sure that legally I'm okay in all these categories. So
Yeah.
I think that does mean that we are out of candidates other than Mike Pettin.
And I don't have a natural or strong urge to be anti Mike Pettin at all. I think actually there's some value there in terms of continuity of ideas and scheme. And then he's got knowledge. He's got 1 year of hands-on knowledge of the personnel.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So I think there's some value there.
Yeah.
However, I think it is like standing, and getting the bronze medal, like, or finishing 4th in this race. I don't,
Yep.
I truly think that. And they can, Kevin O'Connell and Kwesi can stand at the podium at the combine and say all the great things about Mike that they want. And I'm going to believe most of it, but they cannot convince me that he was really one of their top 2 or 3 candidates.
He was a fallback. Just in case what is currently happening happens, we have a candidate. So we can publicly tell the world that we were looking into him versus getting caught with our pants down, essentially.
And that is no disrespect to Coach Pettin, who has great experience and might do a great job as a coordinator. But that's what I think the reality is. So we'll see what happens. But
is there a chance that Sean Desai takes back his withdrawn? Like, he essentially withdrew from the position saying, I'm going to focus on the Broncos job. And then he didn't get the Broncos job. So now he's without a head coaching job. Is there a chance that he could say, hey, I'm actually still interested? I mean, that'd be a little bit embarrassing. I don't know if there's precedent for that, but
I think that it's possible, but it's more likely that the Vikings would choose Pettin anyway then.
Okay, fair enough.
That's what I'm thinking, but I'm only guessing. And look, truthfully, Brian Flores was not someone that I was like, gotta have him, go get him. I don't even know if he was my top candidate. I was as interested in Flores as I was Raheem Morris, truthfully.
Okay. Yep.
So, and I'm really less concerned about who the coach is compared to who the players are going to be. That's really what I think matters. Is Zadarius Smith here? Is Danielle Hunter here?
Yep.
What's going to happen at corner? I believe they need to bulk up on the interior. So I think those that's material that's a priority to me over who the DC is, truthfully. And I think Flores is probably a 1-year guy anyway.
Absolutely. He would be there simply to help build a foundation and then expect that he'd be gone a year later. But I think that could be relatively true across the board, regardless of who you hire. If you have tremendous success, they're going to get poached anyways. So if your goal is to have a great defense, which not saying you can do that in a year, but if you did, then you're going to get poached anyways. So I think that's just a matter of reality that you need to accept when you're a good team, is that your people are going to get poached, period.
Yep. Agreed. All righty. Let's talk Vikings offense, guys. All right.
Let's do it.
We're going to focus today on the Vikings wide receiver room, and we're going to take a look at not just that wide receiver room, but some other wide receiver rooms across the NFL, what it takes to have a good room, what the Vikings can do with their room to get it to be an improved performing element of the offense, to improve the overall offense. That's what we're going to talk about today. Now, this is something, guys, that I believe we're going to need more than one episode to talk about. I think we'll hit this again, if not next week, pretty soon. So we may cut our conversation off today. There's some variables here that we need to know before we can really have hard and fast opinions about who they should draft, who they should trade for, who they should sign.
Yep.
Some of the dominoes have to fall first. They can't all fall at the same time. So let's start with the Vikings room as it stands right now. Gyles, I'll let you take the floor here and walk us through it. I think the folks listening know who's in the room, but shape this environment the way you want to shape it, who's currently in the room. And then let's talk about a good wide receiver room in the NFL. What's it look like and how did it become good?
Absolutely. So to recap the audience with the wide receiver room for the Minnesota Vikings, you have Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen, KJ Osborne, Jalen Reagor, and then Jalen Nailor. Those are your 5 wide receivers that you have under contract. Now, I think it's important to note, except for Jalen Nailor, every one of those is up for a contract at the in 2024. So this next season is their last season under contract. And I think everyone agrees that Justin Jefferson's going to get an extension, minus something catastrophic. He's going to get extended probably in a big way. So you can make the assumption that he'll probably get extended to 2030 even. But Justin Jefferson currently under contract for 2024. Same for Adam Thielen, KJ Osborne, and Jalen Reagor. All of them for 2024. Now, they all have a varying degree of cap hit, but we'll get into that in a little bit. I wanted to go over their general performance to understand, what worked and what didn't in the 2022 season. Because I think it's important for you to understand that if you want to figure out how do I improve. Because I think the objective of this show, albeit maybe outlandish in some ways, not in others, but we're trying to become the number 1 offense in the NFL. Now, obviously, only one team can hold that position. Every team is gunning for it. Some teams are never going to hit it. Some teams are closer than others. I actually think our team is in an interesting spot to be able to actually achieve that given the right circumstances. So the objective of today's conversation is, if that was our priority as a team, if I was Quezzy and I said we have to be the number 1 offense, what would we do? Let's walk through what that would look like. All right. So if we chat through some of the elements of the existing wide receiver room, let's see what worked and what didn't. Okay. At the end of the day, the first 2 wide receivers, Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson, they both played over 700 snaps, 700 plays. Justin Jefferson obviously got the fair majority of those targets. So, for example, when Justin Jefferson was on the field, 23% of the time he was throwing the ball. If he was on the field, essentially 1 out of every 4 times the ball was going to Justin Jefferson, which I don't think anyone would be surprised by, nor would you give a different marching order when you know he's on the field. Obviously very huge. When you're thinking about Adam Thielen, he also had above 700 snaps. He had about 70 less targets than Justin Jefferson, and only had 70 receptions. Now he about equaled in touchdowns. So if you look at this, Adam Thielen was on the field just about as much as Justin Jefferson. He got the ball about 14% of the time he was on the field. So, 14, 15%. But he was more often than not leveraged in the red zone. If you want a place to use Adam Thielen, it's red zone, which I don't think is also a surprise to anyone. If you're looking to exploit the strengths of each player, Adam Thielen, especially at his existing age, he's a Ring of Honor player for the Minnesota Vikings. His focus moving forward should be in red zone. Now, we'll get into where that maybe should be, but red zone, I think, is the focus for Adam Thielen. Now, when you're getting down to the bottom 3, KJ Osborne, I think he's a solid wide receiver 3. If you analyze him against the rest of the league, he's an above average, if not elite, wide receiver 3. If you're going to pick someone to be your wide receiver 3, KJ Osborne is a phenomenal choice.
Yeah, that's a good choice.
He played almost 700 snaps. He was on the field 635 times. He got 85 targets and then 60 receptions. He was just shy of Adam Thielen, and he had about 100 less plays that he played. So he did actually, on a per play basis, he did better than Adam Thielen. He had 5 touchdowns, and he essentially got the ball 13% of the time when he was on the field. Yep. So now that really leads me into the non-11 personnel wide receivers. So 11 personnel means you have 3 wide receivers on the field, which means typically your wide receiver 4 and 5 are not going to be on the field. They're going to be in other plays, or they're going to go in as a backup if someone needs a breath. And that's where Jalen Reagor, he got 55 snaps the entire season. Obviously, we traded for him mid-season, if I remember correctly, or maybe that was right before the season. It was right, towards the beginning.
Yeah, it was right before. Yep.
Right before. Okay. So he did have a full season. He got 55 plays, 13 targets, and 8 receptions. Did get about 100 yards. He got the ball 23% of the time he was on the field. So when he was brought out, he was targeted just about as much as Justin Jefferson. So wasn't horrible. And then when you look at Jalen Nailor, this is where I think there's a really intriguing element here. He is in the category of 20% of snaps. So if you look at the vast majority of analysis, they usually talk about players that got at least 20% of snaps, right? Well, if you were to look at that other group of wide receivers, everyone else that didn't play 20% of snaps, there were 83 of them specifically in the NFL. Jalen Nailor was the number one wide receiver in that group. He was the best group in the non-20% category.
Wow. Okay.
And he still got 31 plays and 179 yards. He got the ball 38% of the time he was on the field and averaged out at a 91.6 grade, which is very good considering, it wasn't just 2 plays he was on there. It wasn't a lot, but it wasn't a little, and he did very, very well. His average depth of target was about 12 yards. He actually led the team in average depth of target, so he's more of a deep threat. So I think that's something to consider, considering how you want the wide receiver room to look like and how you want it to be ordered. Where do you put Jalen Nailor? And I would definitely say he should be above the 6th or the 5th position. Even if it's 4th, I think he should be above the 5th wide receiver. And more importantly, he's the only current wide receiver on our team that is under contract beyond next year. He's on our team through 2026. So he has the lowest cap hit currently. He's only 23 years old. I think there's a real interesting element when it comes to Jalen Nailor. Additionally, when you think about yards per reception, he also leads the league, or leads the team rather. He had 19 yards per reception, and he had 68 yards after the catch. So he is a phenomenal yards after catch wide receiver when he is on the field. Now am I trying to say that he'll be the best wide receiver or one of the best next year? I'm not saying that, but I'm also not saying that, right? I think there's an upside here that needs to be seen if he can actually achieve it. So that's kind of going through the existing personnel that the Minnesota Vikings have under contract. Any thoughts, questions before we move on?
Interesting look at that, Gyles. And the most interesting part of it to me, I think you just elevated a little bit of my optimism on Jalen Nailor. I think for myself and for maybe a lot of people, he's kind of written off. 6th round kid, Big Ten, Michigan State wide receiver. Didn't see him much this year. You bring 12 receivers to camp every year. You get rid of like 4 or 5 of them, aren't making the team. They're in camp for reps. And I would have put him like just above that, but I don't know. I mean, maybe O'Connell and company and Wes Reynolds and Cousins and Jefferson can develop them. We'll see. I won't write him off. Rager, I think I kind of is one of those, he's one of those, unless I see something different during the preseason or early next year, like I'm kind of like, if he's like if you're trying to make him a component of this thing that matters, I think you've not done a good job of upgrading the position. And I get it. He returns kicks and you traded for him, so you don't just want to cast him aside. I think he's got some raw ability that's decent, but if someone can't come over the top on him and beat him out for a job, I think that's disappointing effort in bringing talent in. So, and maybe that's Nailor who gets over Rager. I don't know. We'll see. But I really think this is surprisingly for an offense that's scored the way it's scored and has the reputation it has. Surprisingly, it's not a wide receiver room with great depth.
Not necessarily.
I feel good about it. I agree with what you said about Osborne, but I think where we're at with Thielen sort of counters how good we feel about Osborne. So I think this is a room that needs to be upgraded. I think if you stand pat here or just do a little bit, I think that you will see a stark regression in performance. And if this part of the team regresses, the entire team stands almost no chance of maintaining its performance from this past season. So this is an area of focus for the Vikings. They got to get better here. They got to go on the offensive when it comes to building up their wide receiver room. If they stand pat, teams are onto the trick, man. I mean, you can't stop Jefferson. You can only hope to contain him, but he's been contained a little bit in some of these games later in the season. So how do we improve it? Why don't we take a look? Is the next step here to take a look at some other rooms across the league that we like, or do you have something to do before we do that? Okay.
No, that's perfect. Cause I think, that trends exactly where I'm looking to go.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, if you're trying to become the number one offense, you also need to know who else is running against me, right? Now,
Yeah.
it's not necessarily meant to say I need to be better than the Eagles in this regard, but you need to be able to be better than other people's defense, right? That's
Yep.
the priority of being the number one offense. It's not
Yep.
just ego, it's performance against the defense.
Yep.
So I think it's analyzing who had the best rooms. Now, obviously, there's a whole slew of statistics that you can look at when you think about the top offense or the top wide receiver room. If we look at simply touchdowns, the Vikings were actually fifth in touchdowns this year when passing. Like if you think about passing touchdowns, we were fifth, which I think is really interesting. I don't think anyone really realizes that. I think people think of us more as a fringe top 10 team when it came to touchdowns or scoring more specifically. But when it came to passing touchdowns, we did fairly well. We ultimately scored 30 touchdowns. The best team was the Kansas City Chiefs, and they scored 41. So they were hands and feet above that. Now, this is an interesting element that I want to discuss here because when I was analyzing these rooms, the Chiefs are actually an anomaly here when you think about how rooms are constructed. When you think about the Chiefs, they have essentially their top 4 or 5 guys all getting similar level snaps and playing time. Now, obviously, their top 2 are getting more than the other ones, but there's a much bigger drop-off after 1 and 2 on most teams. This team, it's more of a gradual slope. 1 and 2 get some, and then 3, 4, 5 also get a lot when it comes to actual targets, snaps, but more importantly, receptions and touchdowns, right? So I think there's an interesting element there where they spread the ball around a lot. And if you're factoring that into ourselves, is that something that we should try to strive for, or is that unrealistic for us?
I don't think we should. And
Yep.
You can come at me if you disagree. Gyles and Chase, I made a list of the rooms that I like the most in the NFL, and the prism through which I looked at it and wrote these down was simply the wide receiver talent, not the offense, not an overall look at the offense and the scoring, just the receivers in the room and which rooms do I like. And the Chiefs, I did 9. If I had to do 10, I'd put the Chiefs there, but the Chiefs were not in it. They weren't in my top 9. And that is not me with a shot across the bow of the Kansas City Chiefs, the team that's in the Super Bowl representing the AFC. That's really actually a compliment to Andy Reid, Eric Bieniemy, and Patrick Mahomes, is the fact that to me, they don't have a top 9 talent level in the wide receiver room, yet they scored the most touchdowns at that position.
Agreed.
I think that's a quarterback and a system thing. And we're going to get to that here in a little bit because I have factors that need to be there to have a good wide receiver room. I've got 3 of them.
Okay.
So the Chiefs are not on my list of teams I really, really love at wide receiver. Yet you're telling me that they were one of the top performing rooms. So I just think that's interesting.
Well, and that's specifically into touchdowns. So obviously there's different ways to factor that in because there's a lot of different facets and nuance that go into touchdowns. That's not the end all be all. Obviously, you need to score as many points as the other one, but there's different elements where you might have been really great process wise, but then the one weakness you had on your team was your ability to score in the red zone, or you were a big rushing touchdown guy. Like that obviously can skew your performance, and they don't lean on their rushing game. So when you think about points, although the Kansas City Chiefs are big in points, that's not always just the necessary recipe. But I'd love to hear your 3 if you want to go through them. Let's talk through them.
Okay.
Let's hear them.
So the way I look at it with the wide receiver room is, and I've had very interesting discussions about the wide receiver position in general with coaches throughout the years. And one of them was a former Vikings wide receiver coach named George Stewart, who was here with Brad Childress through Leslie Frazier. And I believe he was here with Zim for a little bit. I have to go back and look at that, but great guy. Office door always open and always willing to share his knowledge, has been in the league for a long time, has coached special teams, offensive line, and wide receivers. And with the Vikings, he was coaching wide receivers. And the way he explained it to me was because wide receivers oftentimes have this prima donna reputation that sometimes is true, sometimes is not, but perception is reality. And the perception is they're prima donnas. And they are asking for attention, and they're flashy and flamboyant. And part of that, George hypothesized, was perhaps more than any other position in the sport, they are reliant on others to have success. They are reliant on the coach and the play caller. to call their number. They are reliant on the quarterback to throw it to them, and they are reliant on the score of the game to dictate passing. They are reliant on the offensive line to protect the quarterback. They are reliant on so many things before they even get a chance. And so they are asking for attention a lot because of that. And when they do succeed, they want affirmation on that because it's not. So anyway, so I just, So I just think that's a very interesting look at this position in general. So the factors that I think need to be there to have a good wide receiver room, I think you don't need all three, but I think you need multiple of these.
Okay.
You have to draft well. So you just have talented guys there where it's like, even if it was, Rocky and Bullwinkle coaching them, like you'd see that they're good.
Playmakers.
Yep. The other two then are, you have to have a good quarterback and an established system, like an offensive system that has rules and roles and definition and structure, and you fit the right players into that system. So if you draft well, if you have a good quarterback, and if you have a system, if you got two of those three, I think you can have a good wide receiver room.
I really like that. I think, one, I agree with each one of those points. I think they're incredibly important. And honestly, going back to the first thing you mentioned with the wide receiver group, although they are called prima donnas, I can also just view that from the lens that they are just very passionate about the game. They're one of the ultimate competitors. So sometimes that can get mistranslated in terms of like, oh, you're just being high maintenance to like, I care about winning. I want to win. And that emotion can be mistranslated. But I think then translating into your systems conversation, one, I want to go over my next team that I think is kind of an interesting element to try to mimic. But two, I think our team is now in an even better position to try to take a step forward from a wide receiver room standpoint because we'll be in the second year of our system. I do trust Kevin O'Connell. I think he's a great coach, and I think he brings great philosophy into the room. But with that being said, it is a relatively complex system that can be difficult to learn. So I expect everyone to be that much better at their game this year, because if you analyze some of the biggest, we'll call it failed plays of this last season, failed and biggest meaning it's like a fourth down and needed, not the last play of the game, although that could be one of them. There were plenty of fourth down or third down plays where we needed to have it, and one wide receiver ran the wrong route, where they'd run it together, or there was a snafu in some way, shape, or form where there could have been success, but we caused our own failure. Not because we weren't performing, but because we didn't know the right play. And I think once you get that system down better, I think those problems now go away for this next coming off season. But taking that philosophy, tell me if you would disagree, but one of the best wide receiver rooms I think that we can try to model after is the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, they're not in the Super Bowl this year, but they were dang close. And they've drafted very well, which I think we'll get into here in a second. But you have Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and Tyler Boyd, all of which did very, very well. All of them had above 60 receptions. They all got above a 70 PFF grade. Jamar Chase is obviously a phenomenal player by himself, but when you pair him with those other two, they have a phenomenal wide receiver room.
Yep. So they're number one on my list.
Yeah.
The Bengals are number one. They're my favorite room. There's a close second and a close third. They are number one. And I think that the highest probability of success for the Vikings, given their current room, is to follow the Cincinnati model. I don't think they can follow the Kansas City model. That I think they are disqualified from that because of Justin Jefferson. And what I mean by that is they have an elite, no doubt about it, number one guy that they drafted. The Chiefs don't have that.
No.
I mean, Tyreek Hill is gone. Yeah. I mean, they've got Smith-Schuster, and they've got Kadarius Toney, and they've got Valdez-Scantling, and they've got these guys that are mercenaries they got from other places, So, okay. So I love the Cincy room. If you have more to say on those guys, please do so. Otherwise, we can talk about some other rooms that you like, but I love the Cincy room.
Yeah, no, tell me your other teams. I'd be excited to hear them because I think we probably have the same list, but I'd love to hear your order.
Okay, so I have Cincy 1, Miami 2, and San Francisco 3. The Miami 1, guys, is interesting because that is complete opposite of Cincy. Well, not complete opposite, but is different than Cincy. Just like Kansas City is different than Cincy. But the Vikings cannot replicate the Kansas City model, but they can replicate the Miami model because Miami drafted Waddle And
Mm-hmm.
a guy I really like is Sherfield.
Yep.
And then they traded for Tyreek Hill. Okay, so this is
Yep.
not all organic. The Dolphins went to the market to get a guy, and Tyreek Hill, who's really the key piece. And I know, Gyles, that you have an idea for the Vikings in similar regard here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, honestly, I think this is the perfect transition because if you go back to our original objective and the idea that we're trying to be the number one offense in the league, how do you go make that happen? And if you go back to what we were talking about with the deficiencies of our team, Adam Thielen being wide receiver 2 is unfortunately becoming a deficiency. I love Adam Thielen. He's an awesome guy, does a lot for our community, and is definitely a Ring of Honor player. But I think you need to find a way to transition him out of the wide receiver 2 position. That could happen via trade, via cut, or moving him down the depth chart, having had him essentially take a pay cut. Which I don't even like the term pay cut, because I think if you were to go to him and say we're gonna cut you, and he were to go hit the free agency market, he's gonna make less probably in that scenario than he would make with us if he took a pay cut here or restructured. So really, it's not a pay cut. It's more like we want to make sure you make the most money, and we'd love to keep you if you're willing to take less money. And that's where I think a couple things can happen. One, I would try to get Adam Thielen to restructure, because you're going to have a dead cap hit of $13 million if you cut him pre June 1. It's going to be $6 million if you cut him post June 1, but then the rest of the money just goes into next year. But you're having to field $13 million of dead cap if you get rid of Adam Thielen. So the best case scenario for us would be if he can take a major pay cut and then just keep him on the roster just at wide receiver 3 or 4, where we're going to bring you on red zone targets. You're still a great presence there. You have great hands, but when it comes to speed in our 11 personnel format, you are not necessarily in the equation anymore. So that'd be step number 1, taking Adam Thielen and moving him down the depth chart. So then really you either have a vacancy at number 2, or you move KJ Osborne to number 2 from number 3. And for the second, I'm going to keep him at number 3, KJ Osborne. And we're going to leave it vacant. And that's where let's explore the free agency market and explore the league for that matter. Who are the wide receivers that are available that could fill the number 2 wide receiver spot and have us improve our performance? And that's where there are probably 3. Well, I would say 2 major free agency targets that I would look at, and 1 target that I'm really intrigued by that would be acquired via trade. And that would be Mr. T. Higgins himself from the Cincinnati Bengals.
Okay.
Now, that's a big conversation to have, because obviously he's still under contract for the Bengals. But if you've been watching the news recently, he is apparently up for trade, because he apparently wants to get paid, and probably justifiably so. He's proven that he can be a wide receiver 1 in some contexts when Jamar Chase was out. But he's currently 23 years old. He had 500 snaps this offseason. So he had about 200 snaps less than Thielen, okay? Adam Thielen had about 720, and T. Higgins had 560, all right? So substantially less than Adam Thielen. Still a lot, but substantially less, and had the same number of targets. He was targeted the same amount, but played 200 snaps less. And he had more receptions than Adam Thielen and played 200 snaps less. He had 104 targets and 74 receptions. He had more yards than Thielen. He had about 300 more yards to be exact. So when you're thinking about that, T. Higgins had 13.9 yards per reception and was targeted essentially 18% of the time. Now, if you think about that, if you view them as a similar player and similar usage, similar usage as in targets, not in snaps, but in targets, you target them the same amount of times, T. Higgins got 300 yards more in the same context. If you were to plug that into the Vikings in 2022, I think we go significantly further, especially in the games where teams sold out to take away Justin Jefferson. We didn't always have answers beyond that. If you bring in T. Higgins, there's no way they can sell out to go stop Justin Jefferson. And if they do, they would be crushed by T. Higgins. I think this instantly puts you in the conversation to be the number 1 wide receiver or number 1 offense in the league. If you have 2 elite levels, I think you're the best wide receiver in the room by a big margin, considering how great Justin Jefferson is and considering how great T. Higgins is. T. Higgins ended the year as the 22nd best wide receiver out of all qualified wide receivers, 103 of them. He was the 22nd best. Absolutely phenomenal. What are your thoughts initially?
Okay. So I think T. Higgins is good enough to be a wide receiver 1 in the NFL. I am not opposed to having 2 WR1s on my team if I'm the Vikings, because I believe the Vikings have the quarterback, the system, and the head coach to manage two number one wide receivers and get them target share and get them production. No concerns with that. I can also stomach the the draft capital that will be required to acquire T. Higgins. What I am uncertain about in this scenario is the salary cap hits and managing the cap with Cousins, eventual Jefferson contract, eventual Higgins contract. How I don't know how that would work, if it could work.
That is a big conversation, definitely. And I think there's a number of conversations that also need to be had at the same time to decide if you're able to do that, how you'd be able to do that. Some of them are on the defensive side of the ball, what you do with Danielle Hunter, because although his is a manageable cap hit this year, around $13 million, if I believe, if I remember correctly. But if you were to say, you know what, we're going to continue on with our existing system on defense, and in that system, we don't require specifically Danielle Hunter because he doesn't fit what we want to do. Phenomenal player, but doesn't fit into us. You could potentially try to do a player swap plus a pick, where Danielle Hunter, you're going to the Cincinnati Bengals, and we'll take T. Higgins back. Now, personally, I think you could ask for maybe one pick back in exchange, considering what the upside of Danielle Hunter is and the average contract value of an elite defensive end versus a above average wide receiver. Because I don't think T. Higgins is elite. He's not Justin Jefferson, but he's still great. Like he is. I mean, in the top 25 in the league, but he's not number one. I think in the right context, Danielle Hunter could be a top 5 defensive end when used correctly, if not top 10. So that's my logic behind that of swapping players. If you weren't to swap players, and I'll get you to respond here in a second, then I reached out to a data scientist to get his thoughts on what would be required in order for us to get T. Higgins by himself and no player exchanges. And he said it would take this year's first, this year's fourth, and next year's fourth. Now, I'd love for us to be able to kind of negotiate that and maybe do next year's first versus this year's first, because I think there's some needs that we need to fill in the first round this year. So that would be my preference. But with that, I don't know. What do you think?
Okay, so if I were the Bengals and I was like, we got to trade T. Higgins, which I don't think they will trade him, but let's say that they were like, we got to trade him, we can't afford him. And you said to me, we'll give you a first, but it's got to be next year. I wouldn't like that, and I'd probably field other calls or go to the other offers. However, what if I said to you, what if I was the Bengals, Gyles, and I said to you, oh, really, next year's first? Okay, well then we'll do that. But instead of a first and 2 fourths, it's a second this year and next year's first. No fourths involved, but we need a second this year then. Would you do it?
We'd have to move a few things around because we don't currently have a second. It'd have to be our right. We only have a third this year, if I correctly, or is it the other way around? We don't have a second. We only have a third round pick this year. So we have a first, a third, a fourth, a fifth, and a fifth.
So then either it's a draft day trade where you move back from the first round into the second and give that up for Higgins, or you say we can't do a second, but we'll give you a third this year and then a 1 and a 4 next year. Would you do that?
For T. Higgins, I think I would, as long as you can make the cap work. That is, okay. I mean, putting yourself in a unique position, but he is that great of a player, and I think that would do so much for our offense.
I think it would too. So now to make the cap work, what I think the idea I would have if I was in the room is I would say Kirk Cousins is not a spring chicken. His cap hits are huge, but he will not be here for as long as T. Higgins will be here. So let's backload Higgins' money to later in the life of the contract, absorb those hits then, because at that point, our goal should be to have moved on from Cousins for either performance or age reasons or whatever. And we have a quarterback on a rookie contract. And so we're more cap flexible because we have a quarterback on a rookie contract, and we've got Higgins and Jefferson and Hockenson for our young quarterback on his rookie contract.
I think that is the exact formula. I mean, assuming you can hit on your quarterback, which is a big if, but I mean, teams have done it, and it's definitely a gamble worth taking in the right context. Doesn't mean that you should just gamble your future, but I think eventually we'll have to pull that trigger. Now, something that'll have to be sooner rather than later, and I think in this context, you'd have to pull that trigger sooner. But I think if you're trying to go to pursue a Super Bowl and pursue a consistently great offense and team, I think this is giving you those bones to make that happen. And I think the 49ers are an interesting example to look at because Although they're different players, they are stacked at a lot of places on offense where they made a rookie quarterback, one that was taken in the very last position of the draft, look phenomenal. Now, do I think Brock Purdy's good? Yes, I do think he's good. But they have amazing infrastructure. They have a great O-line. They have great weapons at every position. Like, they're giving him every tool to be successful, including an amazing head coach. I think if you're ever going to bring in a rookie quarterback and try to have them succeed, this would be the way to do it. Load him up everywhere else where, I mean, unless he's a bust, he can at least be average, even if he's bad. You know what I mean? Yeah. But if he's the guy, you have now built yourself an amazing tool to go win multiple Super Bowls.
Yep. So if we do this, in this scenario where the Vikings give up next year's 1 and 4 and a 3 this year, the Vikings would maintain their first round pick this year. I would say you probably want to move back to accumulate some extra picks, right? And then with that, you address your offensive line, don't you?
I think if you can trade back in the first round, cross your fingers, and still get John Michael Schmitz, if you're able to draft him, I think that allows you to be a lot more effective on the interior. I think Ezra Cleveland was already great. He was the 10th overall left guard, or actually guard in general. He was the 10th best guard in the league at the left side. Obviously, Ed Ingram had some rookie mistakes. That's maybe something you need to address in camp in terms of either eliminating those mistakes or adjusting that position. But if you bring an amazing center in, that instantly makes your center, your guards that more effective because your tackles are already set. You already have 2 top 10 tackles, arguably the best tackle room in the league. So if you get one of the best centers in the league, similar to what the Chiefs did a couple years ago with Creed Humphrey, year 1, he was literally the best center in the league instantly. Like, he was phenomenal. That shores up in the other 2 positions, in my opinion, where I think then you can be a top 10 unit at minimum. And then you can get a second round pick out of it if you were to trade back. Now, there's a lot of ifs in there. I don't want to be a complete homer, but I think John Michael Schmitz is that great of a player where I do project him to be a phenomenal center in the NFL.
I do too. I think others do as well. And I think if you got to take him in the first, I would think about doing it. You know, maybe not.
He's available,
20.
do it. Yeah.
Maybe not at 23, but if you grade him to be a Garrett Bradbury type player when Bradbury was coming out, obviously, you know, I think Bradbury is solid or fine, but I don't think he reached the projection many had for him. No. But I think if you think John Michael Schmitz does, in the scenario we're talking about right here, where you've traded next year's first and a third this year, I think you got to, I would take the number 1 center in the draft or your favorite center at 25 or 8 or 29 or 32 or wherever you end up trading back to.
Yep. And then additionally, let's say that you maintain the stars on defense this year. You find a way to make it work cap-wise. You keep Danielle Hunter, okay? Yep. I think you make a run this year because this is kind of one of those linchpin points where next year people are going to start getting paid, where you getting a little bit more restricted cap wise. I think next year is when you try to trade Danielle Hunter, and then maybe you could get another first after that. Maybe that's getting too much when he's at that age, but let's just get a little bit wild here and say that you do. That's where I think you could try to trade a few different pieces that are starting to age out, and then maybe trade back into the first to get a quarterback next year. Or the year after, you know, depending on how it works. But use some of your existing pieces next offseason, trade them off, and package that up to try to go grab a quarterback.
Yep. Interesting. I love this approach. I think there are others to detail and to talk about. Yep. This approach is very interesting to me. The concerns would be you're neglecting your defense a little bit.
Yep, absolutely.
And I don't know where you get part of the plan is quarterback on a rookie deal who's playing for you.
Yep.
And I don't know where to get that here unless you take one in the 3rd round or 2nd round next year.
I completely agree. Unless you take other assets like I talked about before this year and use that to trade up again in the first this year.
I know.
But
I don't know. I know you mentioned that with Danielle and maybe getting a first for him.
I mean, technically, Zadarius Smith is also under contract. Now, I'm not necessarily the opinion that you should just go blow up your defensive end room, but it really depends on what you do with defensive coordinator and what you do with the scheme. If you keep the scheme the same, I know I've said it before, I'll say it again. You either need to have Danielle Hunter bulk up and play interior, or trade him because he's not necessarily the best fit for someone backing off into coverage. He's an elite player, and I think he's maybe more valuable for you in trade capital if leveraged correctly. I want to put a big asterisk to that. You could easily fumble these picks and then it would all wash away. But if you can nail those picks, then it would be worth it more in that scenario if you can get a high round, a couple picks out of it.
All right. So we have more to talk about here with the Vikings wide receiver room that we're not going to get to today because we're running out of time. So let's table it because we still have some other free agents, or we have free agents who we like. We have a list. We have their estimated compensation. We have stats on them as alternative ways the Vikings could put together their room. But we don't have time to talk about it right now. So let's table that for next week. There are two more things I want to get to before we say goodbye. Okay. And that is to finish the conversation about Adam Thielen. And then to talk about the Super Bowl. So other than those two things, do you guys have anything you want to get to before we get out of here?
No, that works.
Okay. With Thielen, I'm interested in keeping him though. Not at wide receiver 2. And we've got Osborne at wide receiver 3, but I'm interested in keeping him as a specialized option, primarily red zone third down. Also for depth, where if you need a guy for 3 or 4 games, I think Adam can do it. I think he's got great locker room value. I still think he's got enough ability to contribute. And I think that he values being here. So to make room for him on the roster from a numbers standpoint, I think you can shave off a fullback or a tight end. And to do this, you're not a run heavy group anyway. You rarely ever are in 13 personnel, where it's 3 tight ends, and you don't have a fullback on the field very much. And I love CJ Ham, but I think you can compensate for his absence on special teams and capitalize on Adam's presence with the offense. So what do you think he'd take a 1-year, $10 million fully guaranteed offer to stay here?
I do think he would take that because I think you could potentially ask him to take less considering what he might make out in the open market, considering his decline. Now, maybe I'm totally off. I'm not necessarily a free market expert. So in the comments, please tell me if I'm way off base, but I think you could potentially get it down to like 7.
Okay.
Considering, but we want to keep you here. We all want to be here, you and us. Would you take 7, 7.5, and then essentially cut your pay in half, but still make more than maybe you would make on free agency? Okay. Maybe. I'm off.
I don't know what his projected value would be on the market, but if I'm his agent, I'm sitting here going, we're not taking that. You're going to have to keep him or cut him. And if you cut him, you're taking a $13.5 million dead cap hit. Right. So that's the leverage point. Now, we can designate this a post June 1, but you're just pushing that into another year then. Right. So
doesn't necessarily change what he's making like income wise in a given year. It's more just how cap gets manipulated to and fro between years. Where, I mean, it all depends on what he thinks he can make in free agency if we were to cut him. You know what I mean? Because there's ego involved of how much am I worth per year cap hit wise, like percentage of cap, people bang their chest against it. And then what am I actually going to make income wise? Now, this is pure speculation. You might be able to correct me, but Adam Thielen feels more like a dollar amount guy versus a percentage of cap guy. I care far more about the money I'm going to make. So if you can build a scenario where you're going to make more money this year if you stay with us than if we cut you and you go elsewhere. You know what I mean? It doesn't, cap hits aside, income into your bank account this year. Let's build a scenario for that to happen.
Interesting. I'd love to hear what the phone conversations are like between Thielen's representation and the Vikings on how this will play out. I think both sides have leverage, so I think it's a very interesting negotiation. I just think there's value there to keeping Thielen in Minnesota. Beyond the sentimental, he's one of us guys. Even
if he's wide receiver 6, there's still a place for him. I mean, even Jalen Naylor, who was number 5 rather, he still scored 1 touchdown. He got 9 receptions, almost 200 yards. I mean, he was a facet of our offense, not a big one, but like if you build specific usages for him, I think there's a route to maximizing the upside of what he is at this age.
All right. All right, let's table the wide receiver discussion for maybe next week. We'll talk about, hopefully they'll have a defensive coordinator hired by this time next week, and we can finish talking about this wide receiver room, because it's a key component to what we think the Vikings should do, which is take something that's good and keep making it better, which is your offense. So we'll talk more wide receiver next week on episode 4 of the Wobcast 2.0. Very quickly before we go, the Super Bowl is coming up, by the way. So who do you like to win the game? Who do you think will win the game and why? And then if you could choose the winner, who would you choose? Who you're rooting for? I want to hear this from you guys. I'll start. I think the Eagles will win the game. And I think they're going to win because their offensive line and defensive line will dominate, just as they did in the NFC Championship game. So I think they're going to hold the Chiefs to below their scoring average. And I think they're going to be able to move the ball down the field effectively. So I think the Eagles will win in like a traditionally close scoring normal game, 27-20 or 24-20, 31-28, something like that. Like, I think they're going to win the game, but I'm rooting like hell for the Chiefs. I love Andy Reid. I don't love Philadelphia. And, I think Mahomes is fun to watch and cool. I really like Andy Reid, and I love that story. And I think him beating the Eagles in the Super Bowl is very cool. So I'm rooting for the Chiefs.
Honestly, I have a very similar opinion. I believe that the Eagles have the better roster. When you're exploring all facets of position groups, Eagles have a better roster, period. And they don't have a train wreck at quarterback either. So it's not like, oh, you have a great team, but quarterback, like he's a good quarterback. I think he's proven himself this year. But I think Mahomes is that much better. That's not a slight to Hurts. I think Mahomes is that much better. And I believe Andy Reid, aside from maybe Kyle Shanahan, is the best coach in the league. So that's where I do give a slight advantage to the Chiefs. Because I think if they have the ability to win the game, it'll be because of their creativity. And I think they've proven time in and time out this year that they can be creative. I mean, even that one play where they were doing the carousel and all of a sudden they were in formation, cool. They were gone. It obviously didn't work the way they wanted to because of a penalty, but make the penalty go away, it worked. There were some elements there, and I think they will throw some interesting threads into this now that Mahomes is maybe a little bit healthier than he was last time in the Super Bowl. So I'm also rooting for the Chiefs, so maybe my homer nature is coming out. I'm rooting more against the Eagles than I am for the Chiefs, if we're being completely honest, but that's where I'm at. How about you, Chase?
Yeah, I'll never be able to root for the city of Philadelphia on anything. But the thing about it, I feel like they do have the better team, but their inability to get their stars involved is kind of worrying me. Because like we said, they had a pretty easy path, and like AJ Brown hasn't done much in the playoffs. Devontae Smith hasn't done much in the playoffs. They've been going to guys like Gainwell and some other guys that's like maybe that can carry them through, but they're not getting their guys involved, and that kind of worries me. But then also the Chiefs, I just got to side with experience here. I don't want to bet against Patrick Mahomes. You guys know how highly I think of the Cincinnati Bengals, and the Chiefs just took them down. So I don't know. I'm going to go with the Chiefs in a close one. I'm going to go 33-27. And I'm also rooting for the Chiefs. So
Boom. Go Red.
All righty. That's going to do it for this episode of the Wobcast. We thank you all for listening. We encourage you to continue listening. Find the Wobcast wherever you find all of your other favorite podcasts: Google Play, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We're also on YouTube. If you haven't seen us there, check us out on YouTube. Come find me on Twitter. Let us know what we said that was wrong. Let us know what we said that you agree with. Give us ideas for future show topics at Wobby on Twitter. For Gyles and Chase, this is Wobby signing off for now. Back next week, though, to talk more Vikings offense and wide receivers. Skol Vikings.